Late on a Tuesday morning in September, at a regional bison dispersal auction outside Miles City, Montana, 52-year-old Ethan Mercer stood at the rail an hour before bidding opened, watching something nobody else in the barn seemed to notice. 19 bison stood together at the far end of the pens, thin, rough-coated, the kind of animals a room full of buyers would walk straight past on their way to the big, well-conditioned lots selling for real money. But the older cows in that group weren't standing the way tired, defeated animals stand. They were positioned deliberately, Ethan realized, watching them for a full 10 minutes without moving. The younger ones pushed toward the center, the older cows facing outward along the fence line. The whole group behaving less like 19 unrelated culls and more like a herd that had never once stopped acting like one. By the time the auctioneer got to that pen, he barely spent 30 seconds on them. "Bottom end of the herd," he said, and opened the bidding low enough that it barely qualified as an insult. Nobody raised a hand. Ethan did. A rancher 2 rows back turned to see who'd bid, then laughed once he confirmed it. "You really want those?" Ethan nodded, and when the bidding stalled a second time, he raised his number again and walked out an hour later, having bought all 19 animals for less than the price of 2 of the good-looking ones sold that same morning. "You didn't buy bison, Ethan," another rancher told him at the loading chute. "You bought a vet bill." "We'll see," Ethan said, and didn't explain the part he hadn't told anyone yet, that he hadn't been looking at how those animals looked at all. He'd been watching what they were still doing, out of instinct, in a holding pen at an auction that had already decided they were worthless. What Ethan saw in those 19 bison that morning would take a brutal winter, a worse drought, and an old woman's 40-year-old memory to fully explain. As you watch, see if you can figure out what it was, because by the following spring, the same ranchers who laughed at him would be the ones asking to get on his calf list. Ethan ran 600 acres of rough eastern Montana prairie, ground his father had worked before him and his father's father before that. Land most of the county considered marginal at best. Too rocky for good hay. Too broken up for easy grazing rotation. The kind of property that had quietly bled off value for 2 generations while flatter, richer ground around it kept climbing. He'd been running a small cattle operation there for most of his adult life, struggling through several increasingly dry years, looking for some way to make the place productive without constantly buying feed he couldn't afford. His neighbor Roy Halvorson ran the largest commercial operation in the county, cattle mostly, with a growing bison herd he'd built up over the past decade chasing the premium meat market. Big, well-conditioned animals bred and fed for rapid growth. Roy had never been outright cruel about Ethan's struggles, but he had a way of mentioning them at the diner that made cruelty almost beside the point. "Heard you bought the culls out at Miles City," Roy said, the first time he ran into Ethan in town after the auction. 19 head. For what? For $100 total. About that. Ethan, I've run bison 11 years. Those animals didn't get culled because somebody made a mistake. They got culled because they're the bottom of the gene pool. You're going to spend the winter nursing sick animals that were never going to amount to anything even healthy. Ethan didn't argue the point, mostly because he didn't yet have anything more concrete to offer than a feeling he couldn't fully explain, watching a pen of animals behave like a herd that hadn't given up on itself. The first week home was rough enough that Roy's prediction looked, for a while, entirely reasonable. The animals lost more weight during the stress of transport before they started to stabilize, ribs more visible by the 3rd day than they'd been coming off the trailer, which did nothing for Ethan's confidence, even though he understood the stress of a move could do that to any animal, healthy or not. One cow refused to enter the handling chute entirely on the second morning, backing into the corner of the pen with a wild-eyed panic that Ethan recognized immediately as something beyond ordinary stubbornness. An animal that had clearly been pushed through chutes and processing systems more roughly than it should have been, somewhere along the way. He spent the better part of an hour working her through it patiently, talking low, giving ground when she needed it rather than forcing the issue the way a faster operation might have, until she finally walked through on her own rather than being driven. Another had an old leg injury that made her walk with a hitch. Ethan's vet, a younger man named Casey Doyle who came out to check the herd that first week, didn't love the look of. "Watch that one close," Casey told him, running a hand down the cow's leg while she stood tense but tolerant under his touch. "Could be nothing. Could also go bad fast if she's putting weight on it wrong. Old injury, healed crooked by the look of it. Nobody said it right the first time, or nobody bothered trying. Ethan didn't pretend everything was fine. He separated the two animals that genuinely needed attention, treated what needed treating, and gave the rest of the herd time to settle rather than rushing them onto easy pasture the way instinct told most ranchers to do with recovering stock. Instead, once the worst of the transport stress had passed, he moved them onto a rough section of native prairie at the back of the property, ground that had gone unused for years, thick with the kind of woody brush and deep-rooted native grass that Ethan's own cattle operation had never bothered grazing because it looked, to conventional eyes, like poor forage rather than good. Roy heard about that decision within the week and made sure Ethan heard what he thought of it. "You're putting sick animals on your worst ground? Ethan, that's backward. You baby them on good grass till they're strong. Then you move them to the rough stuff." "Maybe for cattle," Ethan said. He found his father's answer to that, in a way, going through an old ranch journal in the barn loft that same week. A box he hadn't fully sorted since Walt died 6 years earlier, mostly out of the particular reluctance people have about going through a parent's handwriting too soon after losing them. The journal itself was unremarkable at first glance, its cover soft with age, pages of decades of ordinary entries about weather and stock and hay yields in his father's cramped, practical hand. Ethan almost put it back without reading past the first dozen pages. Then he hit an entry from the 1980s, longer than most of the surrounding ones, describing an old bison herd that had once run on Prairie 2 properties over, long since sold off, and scattered by the time Ethan was old enough to remember any of it. One line stopped him cold enough that he read it 3 times, sitting on an overturned crate in the dim loft light, with dust still settling around him from pulling the box down. The ones that last aren't always the ones that look best in September. His father hadn't explained the line any further in that entry, and Ethan didn't yet understand exactly what it meant either. But he copied it onto a scrap of paper and pinned it above his workbench, the way you keep something close when you suspect, without quite knowing why, that you're going to need it again before the year's out. The months that followed became, in their own quiet way, the most demanding stretch of ranching Ethan had done in years. Not because the work was physically brutal, but because it asked him to unlearn habits built over decades of running cattle. He spent hours simply watching the 19 bison instead of managing them the way he'd have managed cattle, and the patterns that emerged surprised him more than once. The older cows traveled farther for forage than his cattle ever had, covering rough ground methodically rather than concentrating around the easiest grazing near water. They selected different plants entirely, woody browse and deep-rooted natives Ethan's cattle had always ignored, and moved constantly rather than settling into the same worn paths day after day. Twice that autumn, he noticed the herd shifting position a full day before a weather change actually arrived, restless in a way that made him start checking the forecast against their behavior rather than the other way around. He changed his management around what he was watching instead of forcing the animals into the small, controlled paddocks that had always worked fine for cattle. Rotational grazing across the roughest native ground on the property, moving the herd the way they seemed to want to move rather than the way convenience suggested. Slowly, the animals changed with it. Coats that had come off the trailer dull and patchy started to thicken and darken. Weight came back, not dramatically, but steadily. Animals that had looked genuinely pathetic in September filling out into something closer to what a healthy bison was actually supposed to look like by the time the first hard frost hit in November. Ethan wasn't trying to make them look impressive for anyone driving past on the county road. He was trying to find out whether ground everyone considered too poor to bother with could actually support something, if the something in question had been built for exactly that kind of ground. The first real test came in late January, when an early blizzard rolled through the county faster than the forecast had predicted, the kind of fast-moving, brutal system that separates genuinely hardy stock from anything that only looks tough in fair weather. Wind gusts topped 50 miles an hour by mid-afternoon, visibility dropping to almost nothing within an hour of the first flakes, temperatures falling fast enough that the county issued warnings urging everyone to get stock in a shelter before dark. Roy's operation went into full crisis almost immediately. Cattle and his larger, faster-growing bison alike turned their backs to the wind and drifted with it the way European cattle breeds instinctively do, piling up against fence lines in the worst of the storm, Some of them pressed so tightly against the wire that Roy would find rope burns and cuts on more than one animal once the weather finally broke. Ethan watched his own 19 animals do something entirely different from his kitchen window. As much as the blowing snow let him see anything at all through glass rattling in gusts strong enough to worry him about the barn roof. They didn't drift. They turned their heavy, muscled heads directly into the wind, dropping low and pushing forward, using their skulls to plow through drifted snow to the frozen grass beneath rather than waiting helplessly for the storm to end around them. Snow accumulated on their thick winter coats without melting through, insulation dense enough that body heat simply didn't escape the way it did through a cow's thinner hide. He forced himself out at the worst of it that evening anyway, rope tied off to the barn the way his father had taught him decades earlier for exactly this kind of storm, needing to see them with his own eyes rather than trust a blurred silhouette through a frosted window. He found the herd bunched tight but calm, steam rising off their backs into the freezing air, entirely unbothered by conditions that had his own nerves stretched thin just crossing the yard to check on them. Roy lost animals in that storm, not catastrophically, but enough that he spent 2 brutal nights out with a tractor and headlights, pulling cattle from drifts, calling his own vet twice for stock too weakened by the cold to stand on their own. Ethan's herd came through it without losing a single animal, thinner afterward from the effort of fighting the storm rather than sheltering from it, but alive, and Ethan discovered checking on them the following morning, wading through drifts nearly to his knees. One cow had calved right in the middle of the worst of it. The calf was small. It was also up on its feet within the hour, coated in thick natural insulation, nursing aggressively and staying close to its mother's side as the herd moved through snow that would have buried a newborn calf from any conventional operation in the county. Ethan stood watching it a long while, hands numb inside his gloves, feeling something close to disbelief at an animal that young already moving with that much certainty through conditions that had nearly cost him his own footing twice on the walkout. Ethan wrote in his father's old journal that night, in the empty space below the line he'd copied months earlier. First calf, born in the storm. Up within the hour. Watch closely. More calves came through February and March, and the pattern Ethan had started tracking became impossible to ignore. They weren't the biggest calves in the county, nowhere close to what Roy's operation was producing, but they were consistent in a way that mattered more than size. Up quickly, nursing aggressively within the first hour every time, staying with the herd through temperature swings that stressed conventional stock. Their mothers required almost no intervention at all, calving alone on rough ground, and simply getting on with raising the result. He started comparing his own careful notes against his father's old journal entries, and the descriptions matched closely enough to raise the hair on his arms reading them side by side. Walt hadn't been writing about some abstract ranching philosophy decades earlier. He'd been describing this exact pattern in an old bison herd 2 properties over, animals selected, deliberately. Ethan was beginning to suspect, for survival and mothering ability rather than size or rapid growth. The animals he'd bought for $400 might be carrying a bloodline the modern market had quietly decided wasn't worth anything at all. The drought hit that summer, and it hit harder than the winter storm had, in the slow, grinding way droughts always do rather than the sudden violence of a blizzard. Native prairie across the county dried out early. Roy and most of the other ranchers started feeding hay well ahead of schedule, watching prices climb as everyone competed for the same shrinking supply. Some smaller operations began quietly selling off portions of their herds just to make it through the season. Ethan worried too. His animals weren't magically immune to drought any more than they'd been immune to winter. But something interesting started happening as the dry weeks stretched on. The bison began ranging farther across the property than they had all year, finding and working sections of forage his cattle operation had never once considered valuable. Deep-rooted plants that kept producing long after the shallow-rooted grass everyone depended on had burned off in the heat. Their grazing patterns shifted with a precision that started to feel less like animal behavior and more like the herd was quietly mapping every hidden resource the ranch actually had. Then, in the worst week of the drought, Ethan's main stock tank ran dry. A livestock buyer called that same week, having heard through the county grapevine that Ethan's herd was struggling with the drought same as everyone else's. The offer was fair enough on paper, not a lowball, Just a clean, practical way out of a season that was starting to look genuinely dangerous for an operation with as little cushion as Ethan's. No shame in it if the water situation's bad, as I'm hearing, the buyer said. Better to sell strong than wait till you're forced to sell weak. Let me think on it, Ethan told him, and hung up more rattled than he wanted to admit, because some practical part of him had spent half that call doing the math on the offer instead of dismissing it outright. He sat in the barn that night with his father's journal and the original auction receipt, doing math that came out badly no matter how he arranged it. He had enough water reserves for a short period, not enough to carry 19 animals and their calves through a drought with no clear end date. Selling the herd now, while they still had some visible recovery to show for the year's work, would have been the financially sensible decision, and for the first time since raising his hand at that auction, Ethan seriously considered it. He thought about Roy's warning at the diner, about a year spent trying to prove a room full of skeptical ranchers wrong, and understood, sitting there in the dim barn light, that he might have been asking himself the wrong question the entire time. Not can these animals become valuable? The real question, the one his father's line about September had been circling the whole time without ever fully landing on it, was simpler and harder both at once. What were these animals actually built to do? The answer came from the herd itself. 3 days later, when Ethan noticed the bison gathering repeatedly near a shallow depression on the highest section of native prairie he owned, ground he'd never considered worth developing, too far from any existing water source to be practical. He walked out to look, more out of curiosity than real hope, and found the animals returning to the same spot morning after morning, pawing at ground that stayed slightly damp even through the worst of the drought. He dug there himself the following weekend, and 4 feet down, his shovel struck what turned out to be an old spring channel, capped and forgotten decades earlier, exactly the kind of feature his father's journal referenced once, briefly, in an entry Ethan had skimmed past without understanding its significance the first time through. Reopened and cleared, it gave him enough water to carry the herd through the worst weeks of the drought without touching his already strained main supply. The animals had found it before he had. They'd been mapping the ranch's hidden resources for him the entire summer, the same way they'd mapped its hidden forage, and Ethan understood, standing at that reopened spring with mud to his elbows, that he'd stopped simply owning these animals somewhere in the past year and started actually learning from them instead. Word moved through the county slowly at first, the way it always did. Then all at once the calves reached an age where their consistency became genuinely undeniable to anyone paying attention. Ranchers who'd driven past Ethan's place all year without much interest started slowing down, then stopping, then asking questions they'd have laughed off 12 months earlier. Roy himself came out that September, a full year after the auction, and stood at the fence line watching one of the young bison cross a stretch of rough ground Roy's own larger animals would have struggled with. "How old is that one?" he asked. Ethan told him. Roy didn't quite believe it at first, the animal's steady, confident movement across broken terrain not matching what a calf that age should have been capable of by any measure Roy's own operation used. The full explanation came, in the end, from an elderly woman named Miriam Hale, who Ethan finally worked up the nerve to contact once he'd traced the original bloodline back through old sale records to a ranch her father had run decades earlier. The same operation, it turned out, Walt's old journal had been describing all along. Miriam was in her 80s by then, sharp-eyed, living alone on a small property outside town, and she didn't need much convincing to talk once Ethan explained what he'd found. She invited him in for coffee, and disappeared into another room for a few minutes before coming back with a small photo album, its pages gone soft and yellow with age. She found the page she wanted and turned the album around to face him, a black and white photograph of a much younger man standing at a fence line, a small group of lean, rough-looking bison visible behind him, animals that could have been direct ancestors of the ones grazing Ethan's own pasture right now. "My father," Miriam said. "And that's the group he kept separate from the rest of the herd for the last 15 years he ran that place. Those 19 animals you bought, Mr. Mercer, they're not random culls off a bad section of herd. They're the last of what he kept back deliberately, generation after generation, when the operation changed hands and the new owners started selecting for size and quick growth instead. How'd he keep them separate that long without anybody stopping him? Told everybody they were his personal stock, not part of the commercial operation. wasn't entirely a lie. She looked out toward her own empty pasture, gone quiet for a moment. My father used to say those were the ones you kept when the weather stopped being polite. Everybody else wanted animals that looked good in September, sold well, finished fast. He wanted animals that were still standing come March, no matter what March decided to do that year. They pushed his line to the edge of the herd, Ethan said, understanding it now. Eventually just called them inferior and culled them off entirely. Once nobody left running that operation remembered why my father had kept them separate in the first place. Buyer probably never even knew what he actually had in that pen. Miriam looked at Ethan a long moment, closing the photo album gently. You didn't buy the worst animals in that auction, Mr. Mercer. You bought the only ones left that still remembered what they were actually for. Once he understood what he was working with, Ethan had the whole herd DNA tested, a straightforward enough process, blood samples sent off to a lab that specialized in bison genetic purity work, the same kind of testing conservation herds use to screen for historical cattle hybridization. The results came back 3 weeks later, and Casey Doyle, who'd stopped by to look them over with him, whistled low reading down the report. These numbers are about as clean as anything I've seen outside a federal conservation herd, Casey said. Almost no hybridization markers at all. Whoever kept this line pure did it on purpose, for a long time, and did it well. Ethan mailed a copy of the results to Miriam, who called him a week later just to say, simply, that her father would have liked knowing the numbers finally existed to prove what he'd always just known by watching. Roy came to the gate that October, hat in hand in the literal sense, the same gate he'd once told Ethan led to nothing but a season of vet bills. He'd lost more animals to the drought that summer than he'd ever admit outright at the diner. Feed costs climbing high enough that his own operation had come closer to real trouble than Roy was comfortable with anyone knowing. I came to ask if you'll put me on your calf list, he said. What are you going to do with them? Ethan asked, not unkindly, just needing the honest answer before he agreed to anything. Roy thought about that longer than Ethan expected, looking out past him toward the pasture where the original 19 grazed alongside their calves, animals that had survived a blizzard and a drought back-to-back, while Roy's own larger, faster-growing herd had needed rescuing from both. Put them on grass, he finally said, and leave them enough room to be what they are. Stop trying to make every animal on my place grow like it's headed straight for a scale. He turned his hat over once in his hands. 11 years running Bison, Ethan, and I never once asked what they were actually built to do. Just asked how fast I could get them to a weight that paid. That was the answer Ethan had been waiting to hear, and he put Roy's name on the list without making him work any harder for it than that. Ethan added one more line to his father's journal that winter. Beneath the entry about the first calf born in the storm, beneath the line about September that had started the whole year's understanding. A good animal isn't the one that looks strongest when everything is easy. It's the one that still knows what to do when the easy years are gone. He understood now that his father hadn't written that line, decades earlier, as advice about which bison to buy at some auction he'd never lived to see. He'd written it watching a drought kill an entire pasture, thinking about the difference between appearance and resilience in the broadest sense a rancher could mean it. And the line had simply waited in that journal for 40 years, patient the same way the animals it eventually described turned out to be, until somebody was finally ready to understand what it had been trying to say the whole time. A year after the auction, Ethan stood on a low ridge overlooking his pasture, watching the original 19 graze alongside calves that had grown steady and hardy across a year that should have broken them twice over. A truck pulled up to the gate below, another rancher, come to ask about the next season's calf list, the same conversation Ethan had started having more and more often as word kept spreading through the county. He didn't think about the auction much anymore, about the laughter at the loading chute or the vet bill joke that had followed him home that first week. He thought instead about his father's line, and about Miriam's father before that, two men decades apart who'd both understood the same quiet truth without ever meeting each other, that the animals everyone else called worthless were never actually broken. They'd simply been waiting for somebody patient enough to ask what they were built for, rather than just what they looked like in September. If a story like this, where the animals everyone else rejected turn out to be exactly what the hardest year of the year needed, is the kind of thing that stays with you, subscribe. And if you've ever bet on something nobody else believed in, and lived long enough to be right about it, Tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear it.